up case studies and success stories of times when invasive species risk communication worked well. And we may also talk about public awareness campaigns. So while we put the last panel on the spot in the last question, this is the panel that is really going to pick up from where they left off. So I am joined by, and we will go in this order for the opening statements, and we will use exactly the same format we used last time, so we'll hope to be able to get to your questions and be thinking about them so that we do. We'll start with Dr. Sudeep Chandra, Associate Professor of the University of Nevada, Reno, then go to Katie Steiger-Meister, the Public Affairs Specialist at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, then Kacey KC, who you probably just get tired of everything that people say about that when it goes on. I want to ask if you're from Kansas City. I want to keep going down the.
I have a hat that says that. I wear it a lot.
Okay, good work. The Nevada State Forester, and then John Kabashima, University Cooperative Extension at UC, Emeritus. So we'll go in that order with opening statements, and then we'll get to some questions and discussion, and then we'll get to your questions. So Sudeep, over to you.
Excellent. So I'm going to try to share some comments from the viewpoint of being a scientist and an academic, but also working with consulting agencies and scientists from agencies. And so communication for us, I think, is key. If you end up reading papers and scientific literature, you have a lot of information in your brain, but a lot of the terminology we use may not be appropriate necessarily for communicating across boundaries. Policymakers or managers may not understand that terminology, and then the public doesn't. So I think it's key to get to know the terminology related to invasive species as it pertains to the impacts or how to control things. And make sure, at least from a science viewpoint, that I understand the terminology and the needs of the policymakers and managers that are out there. So the second key part of communication in terms of skill set development and willing to work on this issue is to understand the timeline and pressures that my colleagues have when developing policy. Often, for example, scientists, we're in a bubble and we're trying to understand impacts, but we don't recognize that there are policy level timelines and management timelines. And I think that's an important concept to recognize if we're going to even have effective communication, because if you let your colleagues down by not providing them information and they miss a deadline, then we're in trouble. The communication breaks down across traditional boundaries. But flip that around, keep in mind that nerdy science folks, we want to publish our findings. You know, that is our carrot, and then for the students that do work on this, or maybe for the agency staff. And so flip that around, and policymakers maybe would need to understand our timelines for publication and backing them up, the policymakers, for making decisions. One thing that helped us at Lake Tahoe, and was alluded to earlier in the previous panel, is we have regular meetings across boundaries to understand the terminology or the impacts across scientists, managers, policymakers. It's really important to have these regular meetings, not just a meeting for a meeting's sake, but something on a calendar that you can cancel if needed. And I think that's a concrete step to establishing and keeping communication across boundaries on a regular basis will help you solve problems. Be open to public discussion. That's very important for communicating information, but it's very important to have dialogue that is reflective of the time, the stresses that someone might be facing, whether it is the policymaker, manager, or someone in the public that doesn't want to remove these species on their property. And we need to be a little more sensitive to the impacts that these species could have on our landscapes, but also to the individual that may need to manage them on their private property. I think creating roadmaps, understanding creating fact sheets or something that's publicly accessible is pretty important for us as scientists to sit back and try to put ourselves in the shoes of others and then say, well, what do I need to do to make sure the information on the impact or the solution that could be out there is provided in a timely manner. And I think highlighting knowledge gaps is key, being very transparent in the beginning and making sure that with our colleagues that we're not giving them information and maybe leading them down the road. So an example of that would be from a science viewpoint, there are always knowledge gaps, but making sure our managers and policymakers and the public understand if you're going to control a taxa or try to control nutria, for example, that rodent that's invading Southern California, that there are going to be knowledge gaps, and we're working without all of the knowledge. So we need them to help us be on board for making changes. And then from the academic viewpoint, I think communication is key, but a strategy for communicating is to serve as an honest broker. Sometimes when we communicate findings to managers or policymakers, and then they're going to convey the information to the public, sometimes it doesn't go off so well if a management team is telling the public what they need to do. And I think this is where we can utilize at least nerdy scientists to play that role of being an honest broker, explaining by a video or maybe via photographs what could happen to the landscape. And I'll end with just one key concept here. And at Lake Tahoe, we've had 10 years of this type of activity occurring, but what really helped us get moving were having key meetings in 2008 and 2007 when invasive species were first recognized as a major problem up here. So we had weekly meetings associated with the invasion of the Asian clam. Terribly boring meetings sometimes from 2 to 3 p.m., but on a Tuesday, it's still on my calendar. And it's something that we could cancel if needed, but at least we had the standing meeting to have a rapid response in communication. And the last thing,
I hope there's no one in the room that comes to those meetings and until this moment had not thought they were boring.
great time to multitask, I'd say. And I think the key thing is, and this was mentioned earlier, is establishing partnerships across boundaries and being open to that communication. So that the idea of having a commercial harvest of crayfish that was opened up across both state legislatures, for example, or committees, that was not initially well received, but not poorly received. But at least we had the ability to communicate across that boundary and make some changes to invite the private sector into creating these solutions.
Great, thank you. Good opening. Katie?
Good afternoon, everyone. I am a public affairs specialist, and I come to you from the Midwest region, so a little bit of a fish out of water, pun intended.
And where are you from that you are coming here today?
Minnesota, and out of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's Midwest Regional Office. And I support communications for our Midwest Fish and Aquatic Conservation Program. And my background is therefore in aquatic nuisance species, especially Asian carp. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Asian carp, here are the highlights. It was imported into the United States approximately 40 years ago by private aquaculture facilities in the lower states, the southern states. It was accidentally introduced into the Mississippi River system, which works like a highway throughout our country. And they have been steadily swimming northward for years and years and years. And in 2009, the alarm bells started to go off with regard to their access or potential access to the Great Lakes. And so late in 2009, a group of federal and state partners gathered together in a stretch of water known as the Chicago Area Waterway System, which is the stretch of water that connects the Illinois waterway to Lake Michigan. And there they held the first rapid response action. And lo and behold, they found a bighead carp. So when I say Asian carp, I'm referring primarily to two species, bighead and silver. Silver carp are the ones that are the attention getters. They're the ones that when they're agitated, they fly out of the water and pose a risk to recreational boaters. And there's a picture behind me if you need a visual aid. And so there have been some metaphors for invasive species coming at you from all angles, other metaphors about how do you get people to pay attention. Well, when something pops out of the water and hits you in the face, people pay attention. So with Asian carp, we did not have some of the hurdles that you might encounter with Asian carp communications, but it did bring with it other challenges. Primarily, what I want to focus on is the fact that we encountered what I will call crisis communication moments with invasive species. So there are the communication moments you have that are routine, education and outreach. How do you get people to be aware? How do you know the way that they can help prevent the spread of animals or plants? But when it comes to Asian carp and things that could potentially hurt you if you're a member of the public and you're not familiar with them, we fell into a crisis communication moment. And so early in 2010, federal and state partners joined together and formed the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee. And along those lines, they also created a work group within their structure, the communication work group, of which I've been the co-chair for the past 8 years. And we learned a lot of lessons in terms of how do you approach crisis communications with an invasive species. It's a little bit different than other crisis communications moments, primarily because there's no closure necessarily. There's always, prevention is the dream, and I'll say that eradication is the goal, but sometimes suppression is the reality. And so you have a cycle when it comes to invasive species communications that you just have to be mindful of. And what we learned with Asian carp communications through the work of the communication work group is that in a multi-agency response, there are lots of things that you can borrow from an incident command system, if you're familiar with it, a joint information center. And so we operated, and we continue to operate, a communication work group that has representatives from every agency. And it's a mix of biologists and communication specialists. And I'll say that probably that was the first lesson learned, that when you have a multi-agency response, you absolutely need this communication work group, and you need to have at least a handful of communication specialists on it. It doesn't have to just be them, but you need at least a few of them. And the reason I stress that is I and many of my colleagues are very familiar with the cycle of, we get an email forwarded to us about a call that happened an hour ago. By the way, you should have been on this, and these are all the things we talked about. Bring your communication specialist in early. That's one of the lessons learned. Also, when it comes to lessons learned for Asian carp, that you can be prepared. We could have been a little bit better prepared for that moment in 2009 when the first fish was pulled out of the water. And learning from that, we never mothballed any of our communications plans and response protocols. And so with that, what I mean is that in 2010, very early, we developed a live fish notification protocol. And this is what structures how information flows across the partnership. Currently, the Asian Carp Regional Coordinating Committee has 27 federal and state partners, so it's a large partnership. Need to structure how information flows across your partnership, and then also how information is going to flow externally to the public. And there is no just general public. There's various audiences within the public, and then there's industry, there's elected officials, there's the media. Being able to structure the first 24 to 48 hours after a confirmed fish find or a confirmed find of some sort is essential. And we did this in 2010, and then we waited for years and years and years. And just when we thought maybe we weren't going to find another Asian carp in a place that would be alarming, lo and behold, in 2017 we did. We found a contracted commercial fisherman hired by Illinois Department of Natural Resources found a silver carp above the electric dispersal barriers in an area called Lake Calumet within striking distance of Lake Michigan. And that live fish notification protocol, which we had created years before and we'd continue to update and improve, it came into play. And so I'll close with the success story in that, putting together all of our lessons learned and having built a communications network within the ACRCC and keeping that network going through monthly calls and annual in-person meetings. 24 hours after that fish was pulled from the water and confirmed as a silver carp, Illinois DNR initiated the live fish notification protocol, and we completed all notification within the first 24 hours. And that's everyone. That's across the partnership. That's to federal executive committee members. That's to the public, industry, media, and elected officials. And so I'll close with that, is that we had our success.
That's great. Appreciate that. Kacey?
Thank you.
As earlier stated, Kacey KC, State Forester Fire Warden. I don't want to leave any of you hanging. My husband is the reason the name looks like that. But when you are born a keister, this is way better. So we can all have that conversation later.
Well, you can talk to Julie, because that fits the slogan that she had. Yeah.
Yes, yes. So communication, we've learned a lot over the years as far as invasive, any form of communication. Clear, concise, consistent messaging. It's so important, and these issues don't know boundaries. We've heard that a lot today. Our agencies work under boundaries, most of us, and we learned a long time ago that when we're looking at issues like wildfire or invasive species, we had to work together in order to even get ahead of or stay slightly behind these issues. And so I think that making sure that these messages are understandable to our folks. I employ 180 people plus a large contingent of inmates that fight fire and work for us. And making sure that they understand the level of technology and technical behavior that we need them to understand that their actions can move these invasives. And why is it important? Why do you need to understand what these invasives do either to our ecosystems, to our environments, to habitat? It's all interchangeable. And so I think from a firefighting perspective, some lessons learned is we're really good at fighting fire. Over the years, we've gotten better and better at working together. The state of Nevada is 87% owned by the federal agencies. And so we have to work together. None of us have the resources available to not share the money and the people and the knowledge that we have. But making sure that our messages are together, because one thing we found early on is inconsistencies with messaging really confused the public, where we thought we were speaking the same thing, but the public was not understanding, and they were almost looking at it as though we were arguing over whether these invasive species were real or, and so it's really important to make sure that these communications teams are interagency, they involve the public, and they involve everyone that really has a stake in what we're trying to accomplish. And then, and then how do we communicate? Some of these issues are very, very technical. I've been told many times over the last couple years that my staff at all levels are not good at communicating because they know what they're talking about, but we don't. And it's very hard to tell people to dumb down that speak or actually add technical information into your speech to make it understandable to the audience that you're speaking to. And so you have to come up with something catchy, because often these things aren't very sexy or exciting. 600,000 acres usually gets you riled up. We're at 2.5 million acres burned over the last 2 years. That's usually pretty good. But yet still we have to learn how to communicate these issues. I think making sure that within your agencies there is a clear path of communication up and down the chain. The people working on the ground are the ones who see this more often. They're the ones reporting that up. But then making sure that we at the higher levels are communicating out and understanding what's being seen so that we can speak to that and get the support that we need from a funding or a policy change perspective. And making sure that those partnerships are happening well before you have the problem, I think is really critical. Because during the time of crisis is not the time to figure out if you guys are friends and you're on the same side of the table. It usually doesn't work out very good. I know that from experience. So I think making sure that from an agency's perspective, I go to meetings all the time and I learn something every time. I'm like, oh, you guys collect that data? Or you guys collect this data, we collect this data. Nobody loves looking at data, I would say. Well, maybe some people do, but most of us don't. But it is so critical that we're sharing that and then making it accessible in a form that's understandable to the public. I would share an example of a success that was kind of interesting to me. I worked for a stint at the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources in sage-grouse habitat issues when we were going through the record of decision the first time and learning how are we going to deal with sage-grouse habitat, the potential listing of the greater sage-grouse. And we took a tour of a wildfire that had happened over 10 years ago. And we were speaking to this from a land management and a firefighting perspective. We were looking at the rehabilitation that had been done on both sides of the road. On one side, we seeded, on the other side, we did not. And it was very clear the difference in the outcomes. We were speaking to this as a huge success because on the side that we had seeded, there were bunch grasses, there were native but there was still cheatgrass. We had some cheatgrass, but it was much less than what we had in native vegetation. And from a land management perspective, we were like, we won because we're not going to get rid of cheatgrass. But there were others in our group that said, you failed. You have totally failed. Your goal was to get rid of cheatgrass and it's there, so you fail. And it was like, oh, I get it. We don't all understand the same page. And so how do we communicate that? What is our bar for success? That's oftentimes really critical to understand. What are we trying to even tell people? I mean, I think we've now gotten to the point where I think all agencies understand the eradication of cheatgrass is likely not possible in our future. But how do we live with and manage it from a management perspective so we don't forward its progress? And in our rehabilitation, how do we gain some successes in areas where we aren't as successful? And so just looking at it differently is like, we thought we were winning, others thought we were losing. That's obviously a communication issue. And that's all I would begin with this morning.
Great. Thank you, Casey. John?
Well, I'm going to have slides because I work for the University of California Cooperative Extension, and we always show slides. So the University of California Cooperative Extension, as a way of introduction, is part of the statewide division of agriculture and natural resources. And that is comprised of over 1,000 academics from Davis, Berkeley, and Riverside, the basic research people. We have applied researchers who are called specialists, and they're on campus and also on research stations and cooperative extension offices. And we have 58 extension offices throughout California. So in terms of communication, the reason we've set that system up is we call it the continuum. When we have a major issue, we immediately form teams of basic researchers, specialists, and cooperative extension advisors in the county. We live there, and our job at the county level is to communicate with the stakeholders. When I was still active, I managed the Master Gardener programs, and they were there to talk to homeowners and gardeners. I also worked with all of the commercial ag and arborists, nurseries. That was my job. I was more technical, but I also had to change hats when I talked to the press, because the press doesn't like the jargon. They want to be able to convey a message to the people that read their paper. So our system, and the reason that I really enjoyed my career there, is that our system was designed to go from that continuum of basic research to develop new science and then to apply that and do that very quickly up and down the chain. So this graph here is famous. It's plagiarized by almost everybody I've known who've talked about invasives. And one of the things that you have to understand, this is over cost over time. And then if you look at that curve, that's the exponential growth of a exotic species. If you look at those boxes, the first box is what happens when we eradicate. When we know something's coming, we know it's a threat, we're expecting it, we detect it immediately, and we have a plan, the incident command system, that immediately kicks into action and very successfully, in many cases, eradicates a pest before it can go up that exponential growth curve. When we don't detect something, or we're not aware that something's going to be coming in, and by the way, that is become very common. Many of the species I've worked on in the last 20 years have been species unknown to science. So we couldn't anticipate them. When I actually went on the website and looked at the Western Governors Association's top 50 invasive species, I didn't see most of the things that we worked on that were actually quite devastating, because they weren't known, they weren't named. You talk about knowledge gap, it was complete. And even when we know about them sometimes, they don't behave the same here as they do in their native country. So oftentimes when we do biological control programs, the indicator of a successful program is that we can go back to the country of origin and have a very difficult time finding the pest. If we go back and we find it everywhere, which happens occasionally, there's no hope for biocontrol because it's not even, hasn't even co-evolved in its country of origin with something. So when you look at the containment portion there, that's when we either didn't know what it was, we underestimated the impact, or more commonly, our funding has decreased to the point where we are no longer doing the level of survey and detection that we did when I first started in my career. That's what I did in college, survey and detection. And then finding good restaurants in the areas that I was detecting. And then we have containment. And containment is just a bad situation when you have a really bad pest. And underneath that curve, if you look in the beginning of that, you see how that curve starts out slow and then very quickly raises? We call that the lag phenomena. With many of these pests, you have one insect that comes in. She lays 20 eggs. Then that generation, they each lay 20, and then they lay 20. And it may take 8 generations before you even notice the pest. But it's there, and it's multiplying, and it's establishing and causing damage. But you don't notice it until it's in the millions. And so the lag phenomena is something that underfunded, overburdened agencies often have to deal with, and they deal with it in a bad way because they're dealing with it at the top of its growth. So once it gets up to that top level, it's going to cost more. I mean, you alluded to that, where it's going to cost you a lot of money to control it, whereas it would have been very easy in the beginning. And now it's crossed jurisdictions. It's maybe not even in one state. It might have crossed state boundaries. You have multiple agencies involved now. You start with a few, now you're into the 10s, 20s, 30s. So the next slide is the response that we normally have in that situation where you eradicate it. You have centralized coordination, you had adequate funding. We've identified all the elements that need to be accomplished in order to eradicate this. There's an incident command system. The federal guys meet once a week. You talk about meetings once a week with the federal people, and they start out with their safety and all of these. Every meeting is, be sure you're wearing your gloves, and just I tune out. But this is what happens, and this is what results in a very successful eradication program or containment. And then we run into the 21st century reality. And in the 1990s, Secretary Ross had a series of 20th century invasive pests workshops. And then we had the 21st century invasive pest workshop in January at the state capitol. And the reason we had the 21st century invasive species seminar or summit is because we realized that the world has changed. Things are moving in at an increasing rate, one every 40 days, one new invasive pest every 40 days. And we have a urban forest that didn't exist to any great extent in the 60s and 70s. And now this huge urban forest and population of, just in Southern California, 30 million people, has resulted in a new pathway that hasn't been identified in our current model of addressing invasive pests, especially in terms of agriculture. So I had some pests listed there. I want to talk about the first one. That was a good case of a pest that was underestimated, wasn't thought to be a threat to agriculture, was left for 10 years to go through that growth curve, and then it wiped out whole vineyards in Temecula. Once that happened, if you look at that remember that first slide I showed you, the cost to control something that's has a high population and covering a large area. Well, when you threaten wine grapes in California, that cost. Now, the economic threshold, as we call it, now makes it feasible to go after it. And they raised $60 million the first year, by the way. The urban forest has been identified as important because we're spending money planting trees in the urban forest to sequester carbon. We're spending millions of dollars revegetating native habitat. And this native habitat is now being threatened by the Prolificus shot-hole borer, which is the last pest on that list. And the Prolificus shot-hole borer is now devastating the urban and riparian forest. We estimate we have about 71 million trees in Southern California, maybe another 100 million urban trees in Northern California, and those are all at risk. Willows, sycamores, oaks, a lot of the iconic trees here are all at risk. So then when we don't have the funding, we don't have the centralized coordination, what happens? We get to this, and this is what I call Plan B for the orphan pest. When you don't have centralized coordination, everybody comes together to work on this, and all these boxes represent different groups, urban, ag, forest, different agencies, federal, state, local, private landowners, it goes on. And this is what I call the slide. Nothing brings people together like a crisis, or this is the theme of radio WIFM. So now we have,
John, if you can just begin to wrap up. we
Okay.
need to-
So, yeah. So now we have this situation, and we decided that we needed to do something. And so what we did is we had the California Invasive Species Summit. And I just want to identify that one of the top priorities was to identify pathways and pests that don't fit the 20th
The current
21st
century, yeah.
It's kind of hard to say because I'm getting old. So it was a pretty diverse group of people at that meeting, as everybody's alluded to here. And the good news is that this particular situation came about because there is an Invasive Species Council of California made up of all the secretaries of all the agencies, and there was a California Invasive Species Advisory Committee, and they were both voluntary. This bill, AB 2470 and 2054, what it did, it authorized the Invasive Species Council of California and gave them funding to address the issue, and also provided $5 million to address the shot-hole borer and directed the Invasive Species Council to come up with a plan. And then the other thing that happens when you're successful is all of a sudden other people become interested in collaborating. Everybody likes to be part of something that's successful. So Congress came up with funds for tree and wood pests that were not part of the Farm Bill. And they brought in over $500,000 to address some of the research needs to fill those knowledge gaps. And then the CAL FIRE also brought in several $1 million now because they recognize that these urban and natural forests abut each other, and the fire danger is not just in the forest, it's also in the urban forest because they're intermingled, and one fire hazard affects the other. So that's
Thank you. And thank you for not mentioning the light brown apple moth. Let me ask some questions here, and then we'll go to your questions. And Sudeep, let me start with you. Talk about the communications channels between academia and land managers and policymakers. I'm sure going back and forth, there are certain issues in what they understand and look for and what you want to communicate. How do you bridge that kind of gap?
Yeah, so I think what ends up happening in general, we teach this stuff as being very important in college. And we did train a bunch of scientists to think about invasive species. But the gap that starts is immediately out the door. As soon as people graduate or go on to their scientific careers, what ends up happening is traditionally invasive species are tackled as a case-by-case basis or a region-by-regional issue. I think what you're getting now, though, are more savvy scientists that sit back and they don't want to just describe impact, which is the traditional way of looking at things, but think about predictions to the future. Where are the species going to go as a result of having climate change? how can we prevent them from moving? There's a whole new nifty science around invasion control in the last half decade to decade. I bring this up because inherently what ends up happening, to answer your question, is we've already started out of the gate in our silo. And so I'd suggest in the Western US, there's probably no more than 2 handfuls of really quantitative, good scientists working on invasion issues. And that, to me, is very dangerous. The way to bring them back in, because there's so many case-by-case studies that you gotta do, the way to bring people back in will be, I think the key part for the communication roadmap is important. Having, yes, an incident control is important, but bringing your experts into that control center to answer broader questions. What are the 21st century species we need to look at? Convening some technical team, but a technical team that isn't gonna just give you nerdy, specific information, but try to make it accessible to the public.
Well, let me drill down a little more, because you and I had a personal experience just about 6 weeks ago where my Nevada counterpart and I co-chair the science committee for Lake Tahoe, and I had a little outburst in the middle of the meeting because people were focusing on the science and doing all the science, but they weren't getting anywhere in what it could be turned to early action steps or action. And we wanted that, and we wanted to focus the science. How do you deal with that?
I mean, the way, at least is what I try to do and what I try to train our students in the lab to do is get beyond the science. So for every paper that's published, make sure there's a 1-page fact sheet in front of it that's usable. Make sure it gets sent out to your offices and to a broader group of people. I think that's a starting point, information transfer. The second one is convening meetings. So the one we had, it sounds silly, but field trips are key to understanding invasion issues across the Western US. So a workshop like this is pretty important, but getting the technical expertise back out and saying, here's how you go about treating these things. Here's the other thing to recognize is what to let go. This is something that I think in science communication for invasions is not being imparted to the public. There are taxa, maybe the crayfish at Tahoe, for example, we just let go for the long run. So I don't know if that helps answer the question.
It does. Thank you. Kacey, you're the forester, and there are people on the ground, and there's information that goes back and forth from the people on the ground and those in more administrative roles trying to provide direction. How do you use feedback going from the ground up, or how do you direct that based on what you know? What's the intersection there?
We have a lot of ways we communicate up and down within our agency and outside of our agencies amongst our cooperators that have been very successful. Unfortunately for me, a lot of it involves technology. I've been a late adopter of most of those things, and so, but they have been very useful. We have applications that all of our people use on the ground, collector app in GIS, where they're documenting everything that they're seeing, and they can take pictures. It goes right into a map. You can actually have citizen scientists, you might call them. You can have the public start loading this information where they're seeing it. And that's been very, very helpful, because then we can take that, those of us who then gave up the fun stuff to go into a management position and then can look at all the pictures of all the fun they're having in the field and take that data and see exactly what is the issue out there and how can I help communicate that. And then we create things like data fact sheets that go back down to our staff and then out to the public too, to help them to understand why it's important, and then also to have them be the monitors. We don't have enough staff to monitor the entire state of Nevada and all of the issues that we're seeing out there in our rangelands, our watersheds, and our forests, although our forests are fewer than most states, so that one's a little easier for us. But, you know, so using those types of things, making sure that we're looking at social media. A lot of our staff use social media now, and they tend to upload things. We've learned the good and the bad of that. But using those tools, because they put things up there that could be very valuable to other people. So we've been looking at that, having people that monitor those types of things. And then technology bulletins or public information bulletins or whatever it is, media will call the news or put out press releases just depends on what we're trying to get out there. But
And
making
do you
sure-
find there are times when it's just not getting up, or what you want is just not getting to the people on the ground, and how do you deal with that?
Yes, I find that often. So it's challenging for sure, because we all have our, personalities, and it is hard to make sure that the message that you're sending is clear and the message that you're getting is clear. I've had a lot of crises that could have been solved by a simple discussion, but because either they're afraid to come talk to you, or they don't really understand the importance of the issue, they kind of thought, well, we don't need to deal with this issue that I saw out here today. And so we've really worked on the importance of communication, making sure that we're all talking so nobody's surprised.
Well, is it sometimes they see the science and they see something happening, but they don't understand how it fits in the larger picture, so they don't understand how important it might be to you?
Yeah, that's part of it. And some of the science, I don't want to say anything crazy here, but some of the science conflicts itself. And then, and trying to help people understand that there are values definitely to reading those things, looking at the best available science, and then how do we apply that in the management world. Because I saw that a lot in sage grouse. There was a lot of conflicting, or at least conflicting interpretations of science. I find that they're not always, the science may not be conflicting, but the interpretations are however I want to use it for my value. And so that's always a challenge, but there's a lot of ways and tools to deal with that.
And Katie, I was going to ask you, and I sort of roughed out this question before you described the Asian carp, and the whole vision of fish jumping out of water and slapping people on the face is something I haven't quite gotten past yet. So I was going to ask you how you manage a situation where there's a difference between the public perception of risk of invasive species and the scientific perception or consensus of risk.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if that was one example, but how do you manage that?
Yes, that's a great question. So, as a communications specialist, I have sat in on a number of meetings where scientists have said, well, it's just one fish. It's not evidence that there's a self-sustaining population. It's not a big deal. We don't need to do an extensive communications plan on this. And then, lo and behold, people go crazy. It's called the carpocalypse for a reason. And and the reason is just that.
Hadn't heard that. I think there's some other
Oh,
people
there's
here
so-
that might not have heard that before.
There's so many carp puns. I could go all day.
Well,
but-
if you are, just to add to it,
Yes.
if you are a surfer in Santa Cruz, they have 3 parking lots, and the oldest surfers all park together, and they call them the Carp. And so I'm always very careful to park with the younger surfers, so I don't.
Wise, yeah. So, in those moments, it is always helpful to remember that so much of communications is about listening to what other people are expressing as their concerns. And for Asian carp, okay, one fish in a new area, no, that is not evidence that there is a self-sustaining population, but you have concerns, and we need to listen to them and address them in an open and transparent way. So that's one part of the equation. But then on the other side of the coin, and this is the part that frustrates biologists, is when risk is not recognized on the part of members of the public or other audience groups. And I'll use sea lamprey, another charismatic invasive, caught the imagination of horror movie filmmakers. It has rasping teeth and can gnaw into the side of fish, and is pretty creepy to look at. We do lampricide treatments in the Midwest region. It's a suppression game. I call this muscle. We are trying to muscle down the population of parasitic sea lamprey in the Great Lakes. And streams and tributaries get treated in a cyclical fashion. And it's very important to the science of sea lamprey suppression that these streams get treated in a certain window, a certain time window, every few years. And occasionally, lampricide will result in non-target fish mortality, i.e. we accidentally kill a few fish we shouldn't. And when those fish are sport fish and a member of the public only has one weekend to be out on that river fishing, and you accidentally kill a few of them,
It's a deal.
it's a really hard moment, because their opinion is, you shouldn't be putting that lampricide in my river because it's killing my sport fish. And the science behind it is, if we didn't treat that stream or that tributary, thousands upon thousands of parasitic sea lamprey could enter into the Great Lakes and decimate thousands of native fish, especially lake trout, for example. And they don't care. The emotional response is that, I don't care about the science, I just see what's in front of me and I don't like it. And I've had a number of biologists call me really angry that someone doesn't understand the science, and a reminder that it's not about the science, it's not about environmental literacy sometimes, or scientific literacy. It's about stopping to listen to their concerns and just giving them the respect, that moment of, I am listening to you and I understand. And sometimes it requires an apology. I'm sorry that this impacted you in this way, but know that we are trying to do our best and have our eyes on the greater good. So there's two parts to it. Sometimes the biological risk is not recognized on the part of the public, and then on the flip side, sometimes the emotional impact of the perceived risk is not recognized on the part of the scientists, and a communication specialist can help assist bridging that divide.
Thank you. I'm going to ask John a question, then I'm going to go to your questions. We'll have about 10 minutes for questions when we get to it, so just be thinking or be ready. And John, I was going to follow up on your presentation, because you talked about 20th century and 21st century. What happens when you have a new invasive species of some sort, and you realize that dealing with it doesn't fit the model that you've used for previous invasive species? How do you deal with that?
Not very well. We haven't. And that was a reason to have the Invasive Species Council take the initiative to have the summit at the state capitol. We wanted to have the summit at the state capitol because people on the ground level are all impacted. There's no question. Everybody understands now what's happening. And we were trying to move the message up, and it's very difficult to move that message up. I walked the state capitol and would talk to people, and they would nod like you do and say thank you very much, and then nothing would happen. So when we had the summit, the plan was to have it at the state capitol, so we would engage the legislators and their staff and have them attend the 2-day summit and the working groups that were breakout sessions that were occurring. And what happened then is that staff actually initiated the bills. It wasn't us. They called us up and said, we went to your summit, we get it, we want to do something. And then, because we had all these ad hoc groups, we were able to get a broad base of support that then would either co-sponsor or support the bill. And the AB 2054 and 2470 went through the Assembly and the Senate on, completely 26-0 type votes. There's nobody opposed to these bills. They did cut our funding quite a bit, but it brought the awareness up into the policymaker level, and then by funding and authorizing the Invasive Species Council of California, then that made it not a voluntary council, but an authorized council that was funded to start working on these issues that were lined out in the bills. So I think we're starting the process of dealing with this very effectively. I know we're going to have a new governor and new secretaries soon, but we have it in place. So when the next secretaries and the next governor come in, it's up to our coalition that supported all these bills to keep this up. And now we have an official body that we can go to and present to the council and to the advisory committee. And there's an official, it's a public hearing. It's going to allow us now to move information up to those policymakers that heretofore it was very difficult to do. So I think we made some real progress this year by doing that.
I think I'm supposed to be moderating, but a comment is warranted when, after you said that I just nodded at you or somebody might have and didn't do anything. When the light brown apple moth happened, we had legislators that introduced bills to have an EIR before aerial spraying, to allow municipalities to opt out or individuals opt out of aerial spraying. It was a nightmare situation, and I authored a bill that ended up having bipartisan support to do a programmatic EIR on anything that might ever be sprayed and what was included in it, how it would be sprayed, so that there would be no public awareness of what was involved in anything beforehand. It was a really hard thing to do, and Secretary Ross, one of the original Invasive Species Council, was to try to deal with this, and she had to walk a fine line because there were people that really, despite the fact they said they want to know what's in anything that treats invasive species, actually they really want nothing sprayed ever. And so they fight the programmatic EIR in its entirety rather than engaging on the individual items that might be sprayed. And a local county supervisor in my area said you could spray Pepsi-Cola and there would be a general uproar. And so there have been attempts, but it highlights exactly what you're talking about, is how do you make sure that the information passes up to legislators that want to do responsible things and want to head off things that are probably not responsible, in making sure that you take the right actions. We have about 10 minutes left, and so this is the chance for you to ask questions of the panel. Who has a question? Right here.
So, curious your thoughts and your plans and what help you need.
Yeah, we came out with some immediate press releases last year and this year on where this is happening, white satin moth, where we're seeing it. We have staff out mapping interagency, looking for where these outbreaks are, if they're at levels where we need to actually start treating them, or if these are kind of natural flows in and out. We've done a lot of newspaper and on-screen discussions on what's happening, just to try to get ahead of that, because there's a very personal, we talked about that earlier, feeling about the aspens, and they think that they're dying, and everyone comes here for the fall show up into those areas, and we're not going to have it in those areas because they've already, pretty much died in the leaves. They will leaf out again next year. So we've been trying to get ahead of some of that. We've done some spraying in the state park, and we will continue to do some of that, but not at a large scale, because some of the areas are they're just moderate outbreaks at this time, and we're just kind of seeing where it goes from here.
Great. Anybody else?
The white satin moth is what's up in the Tahoe Bay, up in those areas,
Other questions? There's one right here.
Zach Bradford, League to Save Lake Tahoe. I was wondering if we could drill down a little more into some of these public outreach. A lot of public outreach campaigns for environmental perspective are successful with a mascot or a charismatic megafauna. And a big challenge with invasive species is you don't have that. And Sudeep, you published a few papers on the impacts of invasives on some of our endemic stoneflies. And I want to build a campaign about protecting these endemic stoneflies, but nobody really cares about an insect that lives at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. So you do. So maybe talk a little bit about how we can, how do you reach the public on such a non-charismatic megafauna?
He used to work on the coast, and so he's referring to sea otters. But this is our last question, so I'll give anybody a chance to go at this if they'd like.
Well,
Sudeep?
I'll just start real quick. This isn't quite answering directly your question, but we're at the Western Governors Association workshop or meeting, and what's hitting me is we're all here with an understanding that invasive species, whether land or water, can and or affect things across our different subsystems within each state. And I think something that could be an effective tool here is if the Governors Association or each state could contribute some funding for basic communications around invasive species in each state, maybe each subpart of each state as an example, short videos, something that can be disseminated through social media, and then used as a tool that others can then pass on. That would be helpful, because I don't think we need one mascot. I think each region needs its mascot. And these types of tools, it's a doable prospect to hire a science communication person that helps us develop short videos across the western states. You know, a dozen or so videos. It's something that's doable. Storylines are very similar, but maybe it can be tailored for each region. And that's what I think has helped us here at Tahoe. We've had campaigning within a region, but down at Lake Mead, it's nutso down there, you know, in the Colorado River Basin. There's a lot of people. I haven't totally given up, but the good news is we have this information of the gestalt or general storyline that we could develop. The bad news is we just need to tailor it to each region, and it'll take effort. But I don't think it's an insurmountable effort to have a mascot or a video and some. I think our crowd needs to focus more on the future generation of thinking about outcomes and aspects of social media and science communication, and not just press articles and government agency releases or university press releases.
Any of you want to add something as a closing comment here?
I would just, my one item that I would add to that is be careful of what your position is when you start moving forward with communications, because I know you know what you want to say, and you feel very confident that that's what's most important here. But when you're looking out at your audience groups, step out of your position and try to see if there's a different way that you can approach it. That would be my one suggestion.
Kacey or John?
I would just add, it doesn't have anything to do with a mascot, though I did write down Carpocalypse because I thought that was cool, and I was thinking how, and that Nevada needs to grow some grapes so that we care when we burn down. But at grapes, and we have to build a good wine that people want to drink. But I think I would just hit on what you had hit on earlier. It's so important to listen, to really understand all sides of the problem before we try to tackle it. Because we've always come at it usually from our own perspectives and what our mission is and or what we're trying to do in the landscape. And it ends up biting you on the other side. And so if you can listen, and you're not going to be able to make everyone happy ever, actually, but as long as everybody feels a little pain, I think that's how the saying goes, then you must be doing it right. So as long as you're listening, hearing all the sides, and you're coming at this problem together, it's a lot easier to get over that hump.
John, last brief word.
So the 21st century pest model is that people often try to avoid dealing with pests in the urban areas because the urban areas are just full of little landmines. And when you deal with agriculture and you have a pest of wine grapes and you go to the growers and the people who live in the wine grape region, they're pretty simple, straightforward meetings. But when you get into an urban area, it doesn't matter if you're talking about a mosquito that's going to spread dengue fever and Zika virus, you will run into people who are so adamant at these public hearings that they absolutely do not want anything done to control those mosquitoes. And so that is another complication of the 21st century, is the urban centers have become so large and the people who are against anything are so numerous and so educated and so well funded that it becomes very difficult to implement eradication programs in urban areas.
Thank you. Great closing words. This was a wonderful panel, so please, thanks Sudeep, Katie, Kacey, and John.